Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. I'm your co-host this week, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff, who also happens to be the distinguished director of the Park Center for Independent Media and Journalism, and thereby the host of this year's Izzy Awards. And that's the Izzy Awards for Independent Media. So this week we have a special show covering that. And today joining us, we have Arielle Angel, who's the editor-in-chief of Jewish Currents. Arielle, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And congratulations. And thank you for the work that you all do that has brought you to the Izzy Awards this year. And that's what we're here to talk about. So pulling from the award announcement, quote, "In article after article, Jewish Currents writers have dissected the stoking of Jewish victimhood and the weaponization of anti-Semitism. They have fearlessly chronicled the wave of repression against U.S. supporters of Palestinian rights. And they have offered searing essays evoking the slaughter in Gaza, Jewish Currents' frank and critical coverage of Israel's war on Gaza and its repercussions in the United States recalls the best of I.F. Stone." So, Arielle, could you first, take us into an editorial meeting here? How did you all decide that these were the stories that you wanted to cover, and why, especially as a Jewish publication, did you feel it important to focus your energies here?
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for this award. We're really, really honored to receive it. Um, why did we decide to do these stories? I mean, generally with Jewish Currents, we want to do a story because it's missing from the media landscape as it currently stands. Uh, just to talk about some of the stories that we actually submitted so that people have a sense of the stories that we're being honored for. One of them is called The Anatomy of a Moral Panic and uses the framework of moral panics to analyze the pattern that we were seeing around campus anti-Semitism allegations after October 7th. One of them is by a writer, Sarah Aziza, who actually has a book coming out, I think, this week called The Hollow Half, Palestinian American writer, writing about what it means to witness. This was very early on after the bombardment of Gaza that many experts describe as a genocide. And she's writing about the question of what does it mean to be looking at these images every single day, day in, day out on our phones of, mutilated bodies and dead children and whole cities reduced to rubble. We also submitted a piece about uh, Title VI and how uh, administrations and the state was going to use and was already using Title VI as a way to clamp down on Palestinian speech. So these are just some of the pieces that we submitted. And frankly, we just didn't see anyone doing this particular work to our liking, particularly in mainstream media. I think something that we've struggled with at Jewish Currents for a long time is the recognition that the stories that we were following around, for example, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which classifies some criticism of Israel that we would consider to be legitimate as anti-Semitic. We've been kind of sounding the alarm about this for years, and now, it seems like everybody's kind of caught up with us since Trump was elected. And this definition is being used, all the way up to deportations of people who have not been charged with crimes. Um, we've been following the groups, at least in the Jewish world, but also beyond, including the Anti-Defamation League and AIPAC and other Jewish communal groups uh, that have been pushing for the adoption of these policies, pushing for the adoption of IHRA, pushing different lawfare strategies that would essentially chill Palestinian speech or even criminalize it. And we have not seen until recently mainstream media take up this story. And so that's why we did it. I think that I mean, I did a search a little while back just to see when the last time the New York Times covered the Anti-Defamation League. And it was really like a great many years ago until recently. And so we feel a particular responsibility to do beat reporting in particular on these groups because they are very, very essential to understanding what is happening now in the current story, and they have been for a long time. So why it's important for us to do that as a Jewish magazine, I think, right now we don't have great polling, but what we do know is that at least 30% of the entire Jewish community is, if not defining itself as anti-Zionist, is at least non-Zionist. Um, Uses words like apartheid to describe what is happening in Israel-Palestine, uses the word genocide to describe what is happening. Um, when you filter by age, that number goes up to 40, even 50% for younger Jews. And these Jews actually don't have any representation in an institutional sense. There's no body that represents this population, this sizable population in the American public um, at all. And so, and because of that too, that affects, that has reverberations also in media. I mean, that means that Jewish media in general doesn't cover communal politics from this lens. And that means that the beat reporting that's being done, and there's a lot of good beat reporting that's being done outside of Jewish Currents. There are reporters at the Forward who are doing a really good job, but I think generally what it means is that mainstream media takes its cues from beat reporting happening in the Jewish sphere. And if they are not covering these things, or if they don't have the right lens on the stories, they just don't filter up. And so it's really, really important that we plant the flag and say, we're here. We are looking closely at what these groups are doing. We're analyzing the implications for civil rights and basic human rights. And, and this is how it should be covered.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are really important points. And I wanted to you mentioned one of the stories, and I wanted to dig into that a little bit more, the anatomy of moral panic, because something that I appreciate that y'all do that of course corporate media never does, but it's also absent from a lot of alternative and independent media, is the contextualizing of our times and history. So for instance, a couple of weeks ago we had on the show Chip Gibbons to talk about how the US has often sought to deport people just for speaking out against US
Yeah.
policy. For instance, the Palmer raids that
Yeah.
targeted my sister from another Mr. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, among many others. And in Jewish Currents, in that piece that you talked about, The Anatomy of a Moral Panic, the weaponization of anti-Semitism is part of a larger history of creating folk devils and twisting legitimate calls for justice into attacks. Could you talk a little bit about why that's also what you feel a part of the important reporting that you do is contextualizing our times in a longer history that is really fighting against the goldfishization of the U.S. public?
Yeah, well, one thing that I will say is that Jewish Currents was revived in 2018, but it's actually about 77 years old now. It was founded in the 40s, uh, and it was the magazine for the Communist Party for Jews in the United States. And it went through a lot. I mean, our editor, Morris Shappies, was jailed during McCarthyism in conditions that, are starting to seem very familiar for us right now. Um, Also the magazine went through a period of decline following Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, when it became clear that the Communist Party was lying about many of its crimes, and especially related to Jews in the Soviet Union. And the readership of Jewish Currents at that time really felt lied to. And so, just by digging into our own history, we find so many lessons for the present moment, both around McCarthyism and around kind of um, authoritarianism in left movements, and like the need to kind of step back and take a critical eye, even in terms of your own camp and your own movement. The magazine became a magazine for a community and not a party at that time, and had been sort of started the long work of rebuilding itself. And so, just looking at our own history, I feel like there's so much that is important for us to internalize in the work that we do. And I think that's true of every institution, that's true of every scenario. And especially in Jewish life. I mean, you know, I think it's very common to hear at this point young Jews invoking the history of the Holocaust as a way to counter what's happening in Gaza. It's like memory culture has been embedded in us even as that memory culture has been distorted and weaponized. Though I know that that's not exactly what you've asked, but this is sort of what it makes me think of. I think for us, we always, it's kind of a principle of our journalism that we always have in our second section in a feature, the background and the context in which a certain thing is taking place. It seems to us a core function of our work that the history is part of the story. And, the long history of a thing is part of a story. It makes some of our work longer. And, like who knows how that plays in the uh, days of TikTok attention spans. But it does seem to us just essential to really understanding the thing. And we want people to come away from a Jewish current story really feeling like they understand not just what is happening, but the history of how it has happened. And that sometimes for us that's as important as the intervention.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think just the name, like current is a continuation. It speaks of something that you can trace backwards. It's also a current event. And now I'm getting into word nerdery, but I think that that's very indicative of what you're talking about here. And I wanted to touch on another story that was included in the nomination, a story that covers the rise of October 7th tourism, which is just absolutely revolting. But as an attempt to double down on the Jewish victimhood, that's being done, like this is being done during a genocide perpetrated by Israel, and so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of how Jewish Currents is grappling with that. Like you said, that being founded just after the Shoah, but also dealing with this as Jews that were witnessing something that's going on in the name of Jews. How do you feel that the Jewish Currents addresses our role both as Jews but also as Americans that are perpetrating this genocide in these times?
Yeah, so the piece that you're referring to is a piece by Maya Rosen about the rise of October 7th, what scholars call dark tourism. Um, the Israeli government, but not just the Israeli government, also, you know, a host of Jewish organizations, both in Israel and in the United States, have created a little industry around taking people from outside the country to these kibbutzim and to the site of the Nova Festival and essentially re-traumatizing them in order to support the war. Obviously, these are sites that hold a numerous, just incredible pain and horror. I mean, these kibbutzim were destroyed. You can still see flak and blood and all of these kinds of things. And that can be a very powerful experience and a very mobilizing experience. And then the question is, of course, what is it being mobilized to do? Um, we have done a lot of work since October 7th trying to understand or watch the development of memory culture as it happens. There has been an effort since October 7th to think about October 7th as continuous with the Holocaust. And in fact, after October 7th, we heard a lot of people saying, the largest loss of life of Jews since the Holocaust, without any recognition of the fact that the Holocaust was something that happened to Jews when they were out of power, as opposed to something that happened to Jews when they were in state power and as a retaliation for their state power, whether we think it was right or not. I mean, obviously you know, killing civilians is against international law, but Israelis and Israeli Jews are in power in that state. And so it's a completely different situation. I mean, using words like pogrom or talking about it in continuity with the Holocaust. And yet we are seeing the ways that a memory culture that was and a memory culture, by the way, a Holocaust memory culture that itself has been exploited towards these aims and towards the mythos of the state, um, has been sort of continued in this moment. And so we're really, I feel like Currents, in some, not to sound grandiose, is writing the first draft of this history around the memory culture, around October 7th memory culture. And there's a lot more to be done there because the Israeli government is investing an enormous amount of money in turning these sites into permanent tourist sites, and particularly the Nova Rave. And what is going to come of that, and what kind of communal story results, is of great interest to the development of Jewish people, in a communal sense moving forward. I think at Jewish Currents, we're really trying to offer a different path that doesn't go down a road of permanent victimhood, but that sees us in a kind of dynamic relationship as both perpetrator and victim at different points. Um, and we will see if we if we make a dent in the seductiveness and power of that narrative and that story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the news is the first draft of history for sure, and I think that the work you all do obviously is doing that. And I think that in particular, I mean, my dad took me to Auschwitz when I was 13, which I'm gonna argue is a little too early, but yeah, I mean, the preservation of that horror is something that is very particular to that instance, and to try and copy and paste that into a situation like you said that is a literal 180 of the power dynamic is really quite dangerous and needs to be called out. So once again, appreciative that Jewish Currents is calling that out.
I mean,
And
I'll just quickly say
yeah,
that, like, I don't think we should leave our Holocaust memorial practices untouched in this, and we've written about this a lot at Jewish Currents. I mean, you know, I grew up doing simulations of, as a child, of different Holocaust scenarios. Um, and that's very, very common and very traumatizing. And when people look at the ways that Jewish students are reacting on campus, I think that there's sometimes a very ungenerous sense that these students are putting it on to crush ideas that they don't like on campus. And the truth is that they have been socialized into fear by these kinds of activities, by these kinds of um, memory misuses. And that is exactly the point of them, is to keep people close, keep people in the tent and in the narrative, um, through fear, and to keep them kind of obedient to a certain kind of super story. And so, and they are having a very genuine response of fear, even though they are not in danger. And the community needs to be able to look at that and change things about, communal education to allow for a kind of sturdier and more accurate view of the world.
yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really important point and highlights the difference between living with fear as one of several emotions and living in fear. Um, and speaking of being afraid of things, I know that a lot of publications, as well as just people in general, are feeling afraid in these times. And of course, Jewish Currents as a publication doing the work of calling out these times is going to have a target on its back. So I'm curious, wrapping up here, what are the concerns that y'all have, or what kind of fears are you walking with as you continue to do this work and refusing to, for instance, comply in advance, or not shying away from the stories that you've shared here and the stories that you all publish? What are your thoughts on these times and your concerns as a publication that does the work that you do?
Um, I would say that I am not trying to be concerned in advance. So far, we are okay. And so far, the pressures on us are the same as they've always been, and we will meet them. It's very clear what Jewish Currents was set up to do, and we're going to keep doing it. The one thing that I will say that we are facing is something that every single publication in the country, no matter who they are facing, which is that our writers who are not citizens are afraid to write. And they cannot publish under their own names. In fact, they cannot publish at all. And so I think a lot of publications are losing, even if they're not doing anything that, writing about anything that could potentially get them in trouble, just drawing attention to their existence could potentially be dangerous for them for no reason. And that is a huge loss for Jewish Currents and for other publications, uh, because these are writers that enrich our pages with their perspective. Um, and, I've been talking to other people in the industry about what we do about this, and there's no clear answer because at the end of the day, we cannot protect our writers, and we know that. Um, and that's really hard. That's really hard. But I think all the more reason for those of us who feel right now that we are not the target to go as hard as we possibly can.
Yeah, thank you for that. Arielle Angel, the editor-in-chief of Jewish Currents and a winner of this year's Izzy Award for Independent Media. Arielle, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us to talk about the work that you and Jewish Currents do.
Thanks so much.